it's time for the big story. And tonight, it's COP28. The world's most important climate meeting is being hosted in Dubai by the United Arab Emirates, one of the world's top 10 oil producers. Now, it's not often I agree with climate pocket rocket Greta Thunberg, but she says this conference of world leaders is just blah, blah, blah. In other words, all talk and no action. So, can a summit in one of the world's richest oil states deliver meaningful action on climate change? Who better to ask than environmental campaigner and former MEP Stanley Johnson, who is flying to COP28 tomorrow. Stanley, is the location something of an embarrassment, given that it's an oil-rich state?
No, they make oil. They're going to be subject to the same kind of pressures that other oil producers are subject to. Yeah, I'm going there. I'm not actually pessimistic. I thought King Charles started off with a really good message. He couldn't go to, I think it was Sharm el-Sheikh last year. I think Liz Truss said he couldn't go.
Right.
He was here this year. He was in Dubai. And he sounded the right note, I thought. I mean, he pointed out that, yes, we've made progress, but there's a huge amount still to do. And there was a kind of melancholy note, wasn't there, in his speech? He says, dreadfully far off track. Pray with all my heart that COP28 will be another critical turning point. And then pointed out that we're 30% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we were in 2015 when they signed the Paris Agreement, and 40% more methane. I'd say the methane is coming up the track fast. Well, for my money, the really exciting thing about this COP is that already you've had 100 countries sign up to a pledge to triple renewable energy by 2030. Now, that is a big deal. That's a big deal. We had the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, saying, actually, that means getting up to 11 terawatts. Now, I've only just worked out what a terawatt is, but a terawatt is 1,000 gigawatts, and a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. And we know a kilowatt is 1,000 watts. So you can work it all out. So 11 terawatts is big. Now, the point is this. What is the real game changer? The game changer is actually China. I have just spent 8 weeks in China. I have gone west to east.
Are you big in China?
I am not speaking Chinese. I think you have to say Mandarin or Cantonese or whatever. You have to specify. I wish I did. I was with my son Max, who does speak Mandarin, and that was really, really helpful. But the point I want to make is the revolution there is being based on renewable energy. Wherever you go, wind farms, solar farms, hydropower, but above all, they know they're going to get there. That 11 terawatts the Secretary General was talking about, 4 terawatts is going to come from China. And that's going to change
the coal-fired power stations, which are still being built in China.
Yes.
And you don't mention the fact that these renewables may be a laudable aim, but they're still an experiment, aren't they? It's a punt. We can't guarantee that renewables are the answer. Look at Germany, who have invested heavily in renewables for the last 10 years. And they found themselves, until a couple of years ago, still reliant on Vladimir Putin for gas.
Well, I can tell you, in the parts of the world where the sun shines, and there are huge numbers of countries which are sun-shining countries. Where I was, I didn't want to go back on China, but I just happen to know a bit about it now. Okay, 4 huge desert areas. You've got Xinjiang, you've got Gansu, you've got Inner Mongolia, you've got Kinshasa. They are putting, it's not speculative what's going on there. And you see the spin-off. The spin-off is insofar as they can get the energy which is generated there to the urban centres, you are seeing clean air in Peking. I shouldn't say Peking, I'm to say Beijing. I've been going to Beijing since 1975. In the old days, you couldn't breathe in Beijing. Now, and you can barely dare cross the road because you might be knocked over by a soundless electric vehicle. No more cars there.
There you go. You've got to have eyes in the back of your head.
You have.
What about Britain's global emissions of carbon? Around 1%. We've got our carbon down over several decades. We're a world leader in green tech as well. Why should my viewers and listeners be impoverished and make themselves poorer in order to reduce those carbon emissions further, given the fact that it's not going to influence the overall world temperature?
Well, this is where...
Drop in the ocean, isn't it?
It's not a drop in the ocean at all. We're 1%. If you add us to the EU, as you certainly should, we're far more than that. We then become one of the biggest players in the game. Europe as a whole, not a drop in the ocean. Tremendously important. Tremendously important, not just in terms of the effort we can make to bring our emissions down, also important in terms of the finance we can produce. So another thing which is going to come out of COP28 is the climate fund. Now, of course, we agreed the climate fund a couple of days ago, and Kamala Harris, as you probably saw today, has come up with $1 billion contribution. Now, that is, serious money. Even in these days of multi-billionaires, $1 billion is crucial. Very important, because adaptation, learning to live with climate change, learning to get on with your business is going to be crucial. And you've also got to understand that the developing countries do see that who used up the absorptive capacity in the atmosphere so quickly. Well, actually, we did. And if you look at the figures Oxfam came out with the other day, 1% of the world's population contributes actually 16% of the world's carbon emissions. That makes you think. It really does. So one thing while I'm here, because I did mention King Charles, I thought it was thrilling that he wore a Greek tie. I thought it was thrilling that he came up.
Was it a nod to the debate over the Elgin marbles?
It was. I thought it was a very nice gesture. For my money, it's perfectly obvious the Elgin marbles. I don't want to digress. Perfectly obvious the Elgin.
Away.
Well, digress. Well, for me, I mean, as a classicist, brought up as so many of us are, on Greek and Latin and pretty much nothing else, it's absolutely obvious that the Elgin marbles belong in Greece. They belong on the Parthenon. They need to be reunited with their brothers and sisters, as it were, from the frieze on the Parthenon. And I simply can't understand why we can't simply get on with it.
But here are two examples in which King Charles, who I know you admire, has stepped into a very political arena. Now, if you're an elected politician, that's your absolute right. But should our monarch, the head of state, be discussing net zero, for example, given the fact that it has real-world consequences for my viewers and listeners? They're going to have to buy an electric car, get rid of their diesel Volkswagen. They're going to need an expensive new boiler. Inflation might go up. Why is Charles entering politics in regards to net zero and also the Elgin marbles? He needs to keep his nose out of both.
Well, I won't agree with either of those propositions. By the way, he was
not a politician, Stanley.
By the way, he was on to net zero for years and years before the crowd. And in terms of the electorate, I think the argument is simply unrefutable that the living standards of people in countries all over the world are going to be improved if we do manage to tackle climate change. So that is just a fact which is becoming daily more apparent. It will cost
my viewers and listeners perhaps upwards of £10,000, £15,000 between now and hitting our net zero target, won't it?
I can't say that necessarily. I can say that if we manage to go ahead...
Will it cost nothing?
No, I can say...
Who's going to pay for those windmills and all that copper cabling?
Well...
And the solar panels, all the rest of it.
Well, there's a pretty good rule in economics now, which is that the polluter pays principle. So I think we will find that the balance is going to shift towards the polluters who up till now are having a pretty fair, a pretty easy ride. Yeah. So that balance is going to shift. I think what coming out of COP now is something really worth looking at.
A couple of brief ones for you. Are you disappointed by Rishi Sunak's diluting of the net zero target? I mean, he says, yes, we'll hit net zero, but he's given a 5-year stay of execution to petrol and diesel cars and also gas boilers. Are you disappointed?
I think the language which is coming out of this government now is not quite as clear on some of these environmental targets as the language of previous governments has been. And I do regret that. I do regret that. Apparently there were two drafts of the Sunak speech, one of which was delivered in plenary and the other which was delivered to the journalists. And for the journalists, it was pretty much more for home consumption. And I think that we need to be careful before we start saying, well, we're going to have to start...
Okay. And briefly, Stanley, you and I go back, known each other.
I know we do.
Channel 4, E4, The Last Word.
I know.
Brilliant star on that programme. I've always known you to be a conservative, at the very least a small c conservative. How, therefore, can you justify policies like the rationing of meat people being given an annual allowance of air miles, or an electricity company being able to switch off your power supply on a whim. How can you, as a Conservative, sign up for that kind of eco-communism?
Well, I tell you something, Conservatives do also believe in the future of the planet. That's a pretty important point. Now, as it comes to, rationing, I think we will find that we will have carbon budgets. We will have maybe even methane budgets. And there will be...
Air miles allowance.
But I'm afraid that's something we're going to have to live with.
And you're not a Conservative, surely.
Well, I'd prefer to...
No Conservative would allow for that level of intrusion on people's lives.
If it comes to the crunch, I would prefer to vote for the planet than vote for a political party.
Stanley, as articulate and succinct as ever. Do come and see us again soon.
My pleasure.
You know what, that guy, he has not aged a day since the last word. That was probably the...
2005, that was.
2005, there you go. Those were the days.